Jonas Hale pushed his weary horse up the last broken ridgeline as the dying sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of blood and amber. 6 weeks prior, he had ridden away from this land to settle a boundary dispute in town, leaving behind nothing but a sagging porch, cracked plaster walls, and a well that had given up its last drop. He had expected to return to emptiness. The particular emptiness that had always swallowed this forgotten corner of the frontier whole. But something stopped him cold before he even reached the gate. Something was wrong. Even from a distance, pale smoke climbed steadily from the chimney in lazy curls against the violet evening sky. Where brittle, sun-scorched grass had once covered every inch of earth, tidy rows of green vegetables now stretched in clean lines. The stable that had caved in on itself sat rebuilt and solid, sheltering 4 well-fed horses. And drifting up through the cool night air came something Jonas hadn't smelled on this property in years. Baking bread. Burning wood. A house that breathed again. He pulled back hard on the reins, his jaw going tight. He had locked this place when he left. No trail ran within miles of it. No trader, no wanderer, no living soul in this territory knew this ranch existed. Nobody had any right to be here. Jonas dismounted, looped his reins around the fence post, and crossed the porch in 3 heavy strides. The boards groaned beneath his weight. A cold gust rolled up through the valley below, sharp and low, the kind that feels like a warning carved into the wind itself. He reached for the door handle and stopped breathing. There, in the last pale wedge of evening light falling across the porch ceiling, he saw them. 4 women, suspended from the rafters by ropes knotted tight around their necks. Their feet drifted inches above the floorboards. Their skirts rippled in the breeze. Their eyes were half open, lips cracked, chests pulling at shallow, desperate threads of air. Time collapsed. Then Jonas moved. They're alive. Every second counts. His hunting knife was already drawn before rational thought could catch up with his body. He drove toward the nearest woman, a young blonde girl whose eyes had gone wide and bulging, her fingers scratching uselessly at the rope above her head, her chin thrown back in silent agony. The blade cut through. She dropped hard onto the boards, folding into herself, erupting into a storm of ragged, tearing coughs that ripped from somewhere primal and raw inside her chest. Jonas was already spinning toward the second. She was slight and delicate-boned. Her cheeks darkened with deep bruising, her brown hair plastered flat against her face with sweat. She had weakened so far that her trembling had almost stopped entirely. He reached up with one hand to cradle her neck before cutting, guiding her down carefully so her skull wouldn't crack against the wood. She folded against his shoulder, each breath a thread-thin whisper. The third woman was older. Silver streaked through her brown hair. Her skin had gone the color of a bruised plum. When Jonas pressed 2 fingers to her throat, her pulse was barely a flutter. He lowered her gently onto her side and listened. Faint, but present, the 4th was the tallest. Broad-shouldered and strong-built, with purple lips and eyes that still held a flicker of consciousness. Even now, she was working her feet instinctively, searching for anything solid to push against, fighting to relieve the crushing pressure on her windpipe. When the rope fell away, she lurched backward until her spine hit the porch post. Her hands came up shaking but raised. "Don't!" Her voice came out in shreds. Barely a sound at all. "Don't you touch me!" Jonas stepped back immediately, both palms open and raised. "Easy, I cut you all down. You're safe now." The older woman on the ground turned her head with enormous effort. Her voice was barely wind-moving through dry grass. "He's not the one who did this." The tall woman stared at Jonas for a long, agonizing moment. Then slowly her arms dropped. Jonas crouched beside them. "Who did this? And why?" The 4 women looked at one another. A shared glance loaded with something too heavy and too complicated to deliver quickly. The blonde girl, Clara, pressed one hand flat against her own throat and tried to speak. Her voice came out like gravel dragged across dry wood. "Before sunrise. 6 of them. No warning, no explanation. They just came in and strung us up." Jonas gripped his knife tighter. "What were they after?" The tall one rose, exhaled slowly. "They said we were hiding something. Something they claimed belonged to them." She swallowed painfully. "We had nothing. We meant nothing to these men. But they wouldn't hear a word of it." The small one, Mabel, wrapped her arms tightly around herself. "One of them kept saying it was inside this house. that we knew exactly where it was. She shook her head. We'd never set foot on this property before 3 days ago. Jonas stood and moved to the doorway, scanning the darkness gathering across the valley. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind had changed direction. Out here, that was never a good sign. He turned back to the women. We're going inside. All of you. Right now, they may not be finished with this place. Rose lifted her gaze to meet his. Her voice carried nothing but unvarnished truth. If they come back, there won't be any survivors. Do you understand that? Jonas looked out at the darkening ridgeline, then back at the 4 battered women on his porch. Then we make sure we're ready when they do. Inside, Jonas stoked the hearth until the flames drove the shadows into the corners. The 4 women gathered near the fire, close together, watching every shadow the way cornered animals watch for movement. Even with the warmth pressing in around them, the room held a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The older woman, Grace, straightened herself as best she could, her gray shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, the rope marks around her neck livid and swollen. We're not criminals, she said, accepting the tin cup of water Jonas offered. We're not running from anyone. We simply needed shelter before winter came down hard. Clara pulled her knees to her chest. Everyone we asked told us this ranch had been sitting empty for years. No deed holder. No caretaker. Nobody. I bought it 2 months ago, Jonas said flatly. A beat of silence settled over the room. 3 days ago, Rose said carefully, watching his face, we found the gate unlatched. The well was dry, the roof was letting in weather, and the stove hadn't held heat in months. But 4 walls and a roof count for something when you have nowhere else to go. Mabel turned a torn piece of cloth over slowly in her hands. We started making repairs. Planted what we could before the frost. We weren't taking anything that belonged to anyone. We were trying to survive. Jonas studied them. He couldn't be fully certain of their account yet, but the fear in their eyes wasn't performed. It was the kind of fear that lives deep in the body rather than sitting on the surface of a face. 6 men, he said, before dawn. No explanation? They simply assumed you knew where something was hidden. Grace nodded slowly. The one in charge, he walked every room of this house. Knocked on walls. Pulled up floorboards. When he didn't find what he wanted, he had his men drag us to the porch. As a warning, Rose said bitterly. Or for amusement. Jonas pulled his coat back on and moved toward the door. Stay inside. Bar the windows if you're able. I need to look at something. Outside, the stars had claimed the sky entirely. Jonas moved in a slow, deliberate circle around the property, reading the ground the way old trackers had taught him. Patient, unhurried, without assumptions. 6 riders. The hoofprints were measured and deep, evenly spaced. The horses of disciplined men who held formation even in open country. No stumbling, no erratic gaps between riders. These weren't outlaws acting on impulse or desperation. Near the back wall, boot prints cut sharply into the soft earth. Heavy military-grade soles, the kind worn by men who had once carried government authority. Jonas had seen that tread pattern before, years ago on border enforcement details he'd rather forget. At the root cellar, the hatch had been cut open. Not bashed, not broken, but cut. One clean axe stroke to the latch. Efficient and practiced. He descended. The air below was damp and cold. A torch had burned itself to almost nothing in the wall bracket. In the far corner, the dirt floor had been disturbed in careful sections, scratched and turned over with patience and purpose. Whatever the previous owner had stored here was still present, scattered but untouched. These men hadn't been hungry. They hadn't been ordinary thieves. They had come looking for one specific thing. Jonas knelt at the far corner near the base of the stone wall. The dust there had been swept aside deliberately, uncovering something carved into the packed earth with the tip of a blade, a triangle, bisected by a single clean line through its center. His blood went cold. He knew that Mark I organization used it. One only, the Blood Riders, mercenaries for hire, feared across 4 territories. Silent as smoke and twice as suffocating. They operated on contracts, answering to no law, no county, no court. They answered to one man, Silas Kern, a name Jonas had told himself was dead, a name he had buried deep in his memory 3 years ago, on the day a collapsed mine shaft on the eastern border had swallowed a column of men whole, Jonas himself barely clawing his way out. If Silas was alive, and the evidence carved into this cellar floor said he was, then whatever had once been inside this ranch was no small matter. Rose appeared at the top of the stairs, her shawl clutched around her shoulders. "What is it?" Jonas stood, keeping his voice steady. "It wasn't you. Whatever these men came looking for, you didn't bring it here. It was here before you arrived." "Before you arrived as well, then," Rose said. "So what is it?" "I don't know yet," Jonas paused. "But the man searching for it won't stop. Not for you. Not for me. Not for any threat we can put in front of him." Rose descended 2 steps, her eyes direct and unsettling in their steadiness. "Then what do we do?" Jonas looked at the carved symbol once more, then back up at Rose. "We prepare, and we do it tonight." He found the box in the far left corner, partially buried beneath a thin drift of settled soil. Small, square, iron construction, heavy for its size. He shook it, hollow, empty. The latch had rusted open long ago. Years, not weeks, but the lid carried a faint engraving along the edge. Scratched by hand rather than stamped by any machine. Property of S.K. Jonas stood motionless for a long moment, the box held in both hands, the silence of the cellar pressing in from every direction. Then, beneath where the box had rested, he found a scrap of paper, torn unevenly from a larger sheet, as though ripped away in great haste. The handwriting was rough and urgent, the pen pressed so hard it had left grooves in the paper. Must not fall into the hands of Silas Kern. Jonas read it twice, then a third time. He climbed out of the cellar to find all 4 women waiting at the entrance, their faces pale and searching. He handed the note to Grace. She read it carefully, the color drained from her face entirely. "Silas Kern," she said quietly. "I know that name." "Former Border Patrol commander," Jonas said. "Removed from service. There were rumors. Prisoners who died in custody. Witnesses who disappeared before they could testify. His reputation didn't die with his career," Jonas added. "He's the man who sent those 6 riders." Clara pulled her arms tight around herself. "So we were never the real targets. He believed we had taken something from this house. Something that used to be inside that box. Or that whoever was living here had hidden what was once stored in it," Jonas said. Rose straightened her spine despite everything. "And what was inside it?" Jonas set the empty box on the table. The firelight caught the engraving on the lid and held it. "Whatever it was, the man who owned this ranch before me died protecting it. Silas Kern has spent years trying to make sure it stays buried." Mabel pressed both hands flat against her chest. "We almost died for something that was never ours." "You almost died," Jonas said, his voice careful and exact. "Because one guilty man is terrified of the truth catching up to him." He turned toward the dark window. "And he'll be back before morning." The wind shifted just after midnight, that telltale western gust that carries red dust in long ribbons ahead of approaching riders. Jonas felt it before he heard anything. Then came the hoofbeats. 1 horse, then 3, then 6. Slow and deliberate, the unhurried sound of men who expected no resistance. "Cellar," Jonas said, already in motion. "All 4 of you, now." Grace rose immediately. Clara followed. Mabel caught Rose's hand and pulled her toward the hatch. Rose paused at the top of the cellar stairs, eyes fixed on Jonas. "1 man against 6. "I'm not fighting them," Jonas said, checking the Winchester's chamber. "I'm redirecting them." Something shifted in Rose's expression. A decision made. She descended without another word, and Jonas lowered the hatch above her. He stepped out onto the porch. 6 shapes materialized from the darkness at the base of the slope. Long coats, faces wrapped, riding in tight formation. At the center, unmistakable even beneath the cold moon, Silas Kern pulled his horse to a stop 10 yards from the porch steps. He reached up and drew the scarf from his face. The moonlight found his eyes, pale gray. Flat and cold as winter iron, a scar ran across his jaw that Jonas didn't remember from before. Jonas Hale. His voice was gravel poured slowly over dry stone. 3 years and this is where you wash up? I had myself convinced you were dead. Silas? Jonas kept his voice even. You should have made certain of it. Silas's gaze swept the porch, landing on the nooses still swaying gently from the rafters. He reached out and ran 2 fingers along the nearest rope almost fondly. The women. Where are they? Gone, Jonas said. Left at sundown. Silas offered a thin, humorless smile that never reached those flat gray eyes. And the box? Empty, has been for years. Silas was quiet for a moment. One of his men began to dismount. Jonas raised the Winchester without hesitation. Nobody moves toward this house. Silas tilted his head slowly. I want what was documented in that box, Jonas. Every page. Every signature. You understand what it proves? That you're a criminal, Jonas said. That you ordered executions. That you accepted payment to make people disappear when they knew too much. The thin smile faded. Those documents aren't here. Then you, Silas said quietly, become the problem I need to solve tonight. He stepped off his horse and walked toward the porch stairs. Alone. Waving off the rider who moved to follow him. Pride had always been Silas Kern's most dependable weakness. He set his boot on the first step. During the quiet hour before the riders appeared, Jonas had worked methodically in the dark, coating the porch boards with a thin layer of horse oil. Silas's foot shot sideways the instant his full weight transferred. His body lurched hard. His hand grabbed for the post and missed entirely. Jonas came off the porch in the same moment, driving his shoulder into Silas and slamming him face down onto the boards. The cellar hatch burst open. Rose, Grace, Mabel, and Clara, battered and bruised and still bearing the marks of what had been done to them, moved with a focused, quiet fury that Jonas hadn't requested and hadn't anticipated. Rose pinned one arm. Mabel dropped her weight across his legs. Clara threw a thick leather strap up from the cellar opening. Grace, with hands that still trembled from what she had survived, pulled the knot tight around Silas's wrists with the grim efficiency of a woman who had decided that trembling was something she could attend to. Later, Silas screamed. Jonas silenced him with one sharp strike to the jaw. The 6 riders had barely processed what they were witnessing. One reached for his weapon. Jonas swung the Winchester around, level and unwavering, aimed precisely at the man's knee. 1 more inch, and you limp for the rest of your natural life. 3 heartbeats of silence. Then the riders turned their horses and rode hard and fast back, down the slope without exchanging a single word between them. The thunder of hooves faded slowly into the valley below and disappeared. 5 people stood on a moonlit porch, breathing hard. Silas Kern lay bound beneath the same rafters where his ropes had once held 4 innocent women. Grace sat with hot tea warming her palms, the cup trembling slightly but held. Clara was wrapped in a wool blanket on the old settee. Mabel had found needle and thread somewhere in the house and was carefully mending a tear in Rose's sleeve with quiet, focused attention. Rose sat near the window, scanning the darkness at intervals. Old instinct, impossible to fully set aside. Jonas placed the empty iron box at the center of the table. All 4 women looked at it. He rode all this way, Mabel said softly. For what? There's nothing inside. Jonas lifted the lid carefully. In the far corner of the interior, almost invisible against the rust, a small scrap of paper clung to the corroded edge. He angled it toward the firelight. It bore a faded stamp. The official seal of the Federal Court of Wyoming. Not gold, Jonas said. Not a map or hidden treasure, documents, signed testimony, witness statements. Legal proof of crimes that powerful men committed and needed permanently erased. He set the scrap down gently. The previous owner of this ranch somehow obtained that evidence. Maybe he intended to carry it to a courthouse. Maybe fear kept him from it. Either way, Silas found out he had it. Clara's voice fell to barely a whisper. And the man who lived here before us? Jonas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Grace pressed her fingers gently over the rope mark still visible on her wrist. We nearly gave our lives for something we never knew existed. You nearly gave your lives, Jonas said, his voice weighted and careful, because one guilty man has spent years ensuring that no truth about him remains breathing. He looked at each of them in turn. But tonight he's tied to a porch post out there. And come first light, we ride to the federal marshal's office. Rose looked up. You believe the law can hold a man like him? The law with evidence behind it can hold anyone. Jonas closed the box, and what was once inside here may not be lost. It may have reached a courthouse years ago. It may already be waiting. The fire settled lower. The room fell into a silence that was entirely different from the silence of fear. It was the silence of people who had survived something unsurvivable and were only just beginning to understand that they had. Grace set down her cup. We'll leave at first light, Jonas. We've imposed on you long enough. Jonas looked around the room. At the cleaned floors, the stocked shelves, the vegetables growing in neat rows outside, the stable that now sheltered horses where only rot had lived before. No, he said. Everyone looked at him. This ranch has been empty long enough. He glanced around the room. You need land. This land needs people. He turned his gaze back to the fire. And I've eaten enough cold meals alone to last a lifetime. Clara pressed both hands over her mouth. Mabel set down her needle and thread. Rose turned slowly toward the window so no one would see her face. Grace reached across the table and covered Jonas's hand with both of hers. She didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was barely sound at all. Thank you. Jonas kept his eyes on the fire. Starting tonight, he said quietly, this is home. For all of us. And so it was. In a land that had always dealt out more cruelty than mercy. 5 strangers found one another at the edge of ruin and built something from the wreckage that none of them had planned and every one of them needed. Jonas had not cut those ropes because duty required it. He had cut them because life, however fragile, however threatened, is worth moving toward rather than away from. And sometimes, in the long and brutal story of the frontier, a single act of courage at precisely the right moment changes the ending entirely. If this story moved you, stay close. There's another tale from the wild country waiting just ahead. Drop a 1 in the comments if you want to write again.